Tonight's story is brought to you by PhoenFX. PhoenFX is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to helping charities with fundraising by providing them with the most innovative scarehouse and walkthrough events. They have created fully adaptive environments for the sensory sensitive so that everyone can enjoy the experience. For more information on PhoenFX and their services, please visit them on the web at www.phonfx.org. Without further ado, tonight's tale awaits you, right through there.
Welcome, my friends. Come, sit around the fire and let me spin another tale for your amusement. These tales, I tell you, these nightmares found only around the fireside, speak of many things, things which cannot be explained. Stories of the unknown, the unseen, and poorly understood. Some disturbing, yes, some terrifying, certainly. Stories of the darkness which reside in all of humanity, expressed in ways in which nature herself cannot account for, things beyond her ability and even beyond her comprehension, stories buried in time and hidden by shadow. A small colony just off the coast of North Carolina in the 1580s, considered lost because there is no records of the original 121 colonists. Some believe they moved on, others believe differently. The fire in the middle of the village blazed with a great heat and rose high into the sky. The logs and reeds crackled, throwing embers to the heavens, carrying their prayers to the Kichi Manidu for help and to avenge the death of their elders, of their children, and of their werowance. He had no brothers, and so his wife, the Werinsqua, assumed control of the tribe. First, she commanded all the homes of the dead to be burned, and the surviving families would be moved away for a short period of time. If they lived, and was witnessed without the skin spots or the fire within the head, and without the stomach returning the food, they may return to the tribe. Those who were seen to have these must stay away until they are scarred or have returned to the Kichi Manidu. Once this had been realized, she then commanded him, the Manetetu, to cleanse the ground of the burned homes of the evil that possessed them, to use his herbs and his magic to rid the ground of any residual evil and death brought from the Wutushantar village. And when the Mantetu had finished and reassured her the land was clean, only then did she command the rebuilding of the homes. And once the homes had been rebuilt, and those who survived were re-established in their homes, several of those homes remaining empty, did the Werinsqua finally mourn. Through her grief and prayer during that time, she had had a vision, a dark and bleak vision of what was to come. She summoned her Montetu to her and spoke to him of her vision. The Montetu was greatly disturbed by what his chiefess had seen. He was a man of healing and of natural magic, and a man of the great god and those of the north, south, east, and west. He was a man of the animals and plants, and through his wisdom he knew of spells and powerful herbs which could cure almost anything. He had seen this evil before, and it was his advice to do the burns. As they burn the fields to rid the ground of the old before planting the new, he advised, so must we burn the homes to rid the ground of the evil, and then build anew. He knew this would not destroy the evil, but simply stop it in the village until it comes again. Then more would be lost, possibly all. They must strike at the root if they wish the tree not to regrow. They must strike at the Wutu Shantar, but in a way that the evil would not come back to the village. There was but one way, and the Waransqua ordered it to be. That morning, the bravest of the hunters were sent towards the Wutu Shantar village, but told to not be seen. They were to take the first healthy member of the other tribe alive and to bring them back to the outskirts of the village between their village and the other tribes. They must keep the prisoner quiet, and so they must be bound, leg and ankle, mouth and eyes. When they had been successful, they were to bind them to a tree in such a manner the prisoner could not escape. There, the Wutu Shantar would wait for the Montetu. It was done according to the Waransqua's wishes. The baboon had arrived at the village, and with him the cold had set upon the lands and the time of harvest had passed. All who had survived danced this night. Men, women, children, dressed in their furs and their clothes, but barefoot around the great fire, and they danced as the village had not seen before. They ate, knowing they may have to move all they had soon. They shared stories and laughed and sang and mourned those they lost to the evil which came onto them, and threw offerings into the fire, and with those offerings, prayers. The Montetu had his own offerings to make, but they were not meant for the eyes of the village. Only when the village was safe in their homes, and the fire began to die down, would those offerings be made, would his prayers be said. The Waransqua was to be there as well. It would take both the holy man and the embodiment of all the pain in the village to make these prayers. The Montetu oversaw the building of the great fire and then left to go see the prisoner. The prisoner stood, bound to a tree, outside of the village and away from their eyes. He was taller and of pale skin like his tribespeople. And like his tribespeople, he wore the same clothing, a shirt of white and made from thin threads tightly woven together and joined by the same threads in very small stitches. His legs and stomach were covered as well in brown cloth. His feet were covered with black animal hides which came up to his knees and formed tightly over his feet. He wore another heavier shirt, open now to expose the shirt under, made of thicker cloth with metal rounds attached to the front. His hair was long and tied back with a thong of some unknown material. Unlike the others in his village, he wore nothing on his head. His pale brown eyes showed both fear and rage. His body tensed as he tried to escape the bondage and rush towards the Montetu. But the hunters of his tribe had tied him very well. Strange noises came from his hide-bound and dirt-filled mouth. His skin was free from the scars of the evil. He looked healthy and strong, and the Montetu felt pride in his hunter's ability to capture this one. The prisoner was a hunter of that tribe. He had with him one of their weapons made of metal and wood, and was known for its loud noise and its ability to kill an animal at a farther distance than the tribe's own. He also had with him a large metal knife. That knife would make taking the sacrifice easier, and so the Montetu took it from the side of the prisoner, out from its hide coverings, and looked at it in the evening sun. He used it to cut the covering of the arm away, exposing the prisoner's skin to the last rays of the setting sun. He looked at the arm, and then the knife. The prisoner squirmed in vain attempts to pull his arm away. The Montetu created a small fire pit, and then built a small fire within it. He removed some herbs from his satchel and burned them in the fire. He prayed as he soaked the blade in the flames and the smoke of the herbs. Then, as swift as the wind itself, he stood and sliced a section of the prisoner's flesh from his arm. The prisoner screamed. He placed the flesh into a special satchel prepared just for this offering, and then replaced the second satchel back into the first. He stuck the blade back into the fire. He prayed as the blade slowly began to change color. The prisoner had lost his rage, and now only fear shone in his eyes. Fear and pain. With a second scream from the prisoner, the wound was cauterized. The Montetu sprinkled herbs upon the wounds and wrapped the arm in a clean piece of cloth. The prisoner lost consciousness. He still breathed. The Montetu thought to himself, good. He would be needed as such tonight. And now the great fire burned low, and the villagers had gone back to their homes to sleep, maybe, but also to wait for word on what was to come next. He had told the chiefess that, should it be successful, they would need to leave with the coming of the sun, and no later than that. He had also told her that she was to lead them far away, and as fast as she could. If their prayers were answered, this would be their final dance around this great fire. She came to him and stood across from him on the opposite side of the fire ring. She was dressed no different than before, except she wore her late husband's necklace of beads and shells and animal teeth. Each piece marked a memory, and she knew them all. He stood to greet her. They danced and prayed and made their own offerings of herbs. But then the magic must be performed, and so the Montetu withdrew the first of many specially prepared satchels. The first comprised of special herbs. He shared them with the chiefess and made the special prayers as they scattered the herbs upon the fire. The wind blew cold. A second satchel was produced, and different herbs were treated as the first satchel. The wind grew bitter, but the great fire rose to the heavens with new life. The third and final satchel was drawn out. It was wet with the blood of the prisoner. The Montetu alone made these prayers and squeezed the end of the satchel, releasing several drops of blood into the fire, and the great fire went cold. The wind blew bitterly frigid, and upon the wind was the foul stench of death and rotting meat. A thin and bony hand wrapped its long, emaciated fingers around the arm of the Montetu, which held the final satchel. Its grip was strong, and so cold it chilled the holy man's spirit. He turned to look at what had grabbed him. A tall, emaciated figure looked down upon him. Its mottled gray skin was pulled tightly over its sharp, bony features, and no muscle showed under it. In areas, the skin was missing in total, and its skeleton could be seen as the moonlight glinted off the grotesque silhouette. Its skull, as well, was covered in taut and almost dehydrated skin. Its animalistic teeth faced him in an unnatural, death-like grin. Its breath was putrid and cold as it exhaled, and though the holy man's breath could be seen in the night air, the creature's could not. Its eyes glowed from the hollows of the blackened orbital sockets in its skull. It had hair, or fur, all over its body, but it was sparse, as if it was severely afflicted with the mange. With its opposite hand, it raised one talon-like nail and slit the satchel down its side, exposing the flesh of the prisoner it held within. Skewering the flesh with the same nail, it raised the flesh to its lipless mouth and tore a piece free with its predatorial teeth. It chewed slowly, thoughtfully, and, though not releasing its grasp on the holy man, stood quickly straight up. It flung the rest behind it, and another long talon-like finger skewered the meat mid-flight, and in like manner rent a piece of flesh free. And again the second creature threw the bloodied sacrificial offering behind it, only to be intercepted and consumed by a third. The creature turned back to the holy man. It hissed out a single phrase. Ani wipia. The holy man pointed towards the prisoner and the Wutushanar village. The creature released its grasp. A cold wind blew and the creatures faded into the darkness. The holy man turned to face the chiefess. She stood facing him, proud, unafraid, and defiant. He told her it was time to move the village to another place, as far from here as she possibly could, starting now. She must take them in the opposite direction of the Wutushanar village. He turned his back to her. I have brought evil to fight evil, he said. No other than I shall suffer it for now. Go now! She protested feebly. He answered her with authority, looking towards the sky. The Wijigo are hungry. When they have eaten the Wutushanar, they will return here. They will find me, and no other. It was a cold morning. John had had his coat wrapped around him. His musket was cold in his hands. Nicholas had not returned from the hunt, and he was asked to go find him. Nicholas had a predictable hunting pattern, always starting in the same place and following the same path. John, too, walked this path, and within the woods he came upon a disturbing sight. Multiple sets of human tracks and plenty of broken twigs scattered on the ground. These tracks led through the woods and appeared to be dragging something behind them. Part of what appeared to be Nicholas's coat had been torn off and left hanging on a bush. In the distance, John could see the colony behind him. John tied a strip of colored cloth to a tree so that he may find his way back, and followed the trail. He moved carefully through the brush, noting the occasional bush had a piece of Nicholas's coat. He himself left the occasional colored strip of the cloth tied to a tree as he went. After a couple of hours, he found the end of the trail. Nicholas was still bound to the tree. His clothes were ripped open and his skin peeled back. Large portions of his flesh had been ripped free from his bones, and his organs had spilled onto the ground at his feet. Blood covered the ground beneath him, and the bushes and the trees around him. Summoning up his courage, John said a prayer and moved closer to Nicholas. He found that his mouth was still bound and still filled with dirt. A cold wind began to blow, and the stench of death was more than John could handle. He turned and ran back towards the village, carefully, even in his flight, to follow the path he had left for himself. The Wijigo allowed John to reach the place where Nicholas had been taken by the tribe's hunters before they feasted. The scream was heard throughout the colony. It came from the forest to the south of them, a place where the colony's huntsmen found plenty of game. But now this formerly friendly and generous forest had taken a darker turn, and several of the colony's huntsmen took notice. They took their muskets and hunting swords, tethered their dogs by ropes, and went to investigate. 4 of them, each with his own hunting dog, met at the well-traversed path into the hunting grounds. At first, they walked slowly, allowing their dogs to find a scent, but halfway there, all 4 animals bristled and began to growl. A cold wind blew, and the stench of death assaulted all 8 noses. The dogs pulled incessantly on their leads, and the 4 huntsmen agreed to untether them, letting them loose upon the prey. The dogs ran, snarling in the direction of the forest. There was the sound of a true dogfight, and not of simply hunting dogs with their prey, and the 4 huntsmen rushed towards them with their muskets at the ready. Their charge was cut short by the high-pitched screams of their hounds and a nauseating ripping of flesh and shattering of bones. The dogs fell silent. One of the 4 huntsmen shouldered his musket, drew his sword, and charged towards the site of the now silenced fray, screaming. The other 3 followed, the butts of their weapons already pressed against their shoulders. The colony heard the dogs and their fate. They heard the battle cries of the huntsmen and witnessed their charge. They heard the shots of their muskets ring out across the plains. They listened for all the familiar sounds of battle, but they heard nothing after, nothing but the tortured screams of the huntsmen. A keen-eyed young lad claimed he saw 3 shadows at the edge of the forest, taller than the grass, taller than the lowest branches of the trees. He saw them move swiftly with long fingers and glowing eyes. Others had seen him as well. The devil had come from the forest to the colony. The devil himself had come for them, and the men of the colony would keep an ever-weathered eye upon the forest as they stood between the devil and what they loved most. The women of the colony were far more practical and began to pack what belongings they had, and what food they had, into wagons and onto pack animals. The men split themselves into 2 groups. The first group would watch the woods, while the second group would facilitate the move and plan and execute, as best they could, the safest route to take. There were no elders or pastors in the colony, but one man who was especially dedicated to his faith served as a local pastor for them. He separated himself from the second group and knelt down to pray for the safe deliverance of his congregation from the evil that besieged them. He attended to all who needed him within the colony, and then to each man individually, standing the line of defense. He offered them prayers and encouragement and reminded them that to defend the colony was to embody Jesus' love for his children here on earth, and the men believed him and were comforted in the silence of their watch. The mid-afternoon sun blazed down upon the men of the line. The wagons were almost packed and ready to travel. The animals were resting and given extra portions of forage to prepare for a long trek to where, they didn't know yet. They only knew they must leave. The women brought food and water to the men on the line, each, in his turn, ate and drank while the others kept the watch. A cold wind blew down the line, and the stench of fetid corpses grew stronger. From the end of the line came a blood-curdling scream as one of the men fell beneath the level of the grass. A single shadow converged on the body, and the stomach-churning sound of tearing flesh was heard. Several shots were fired before the next man in the line was taken down. A shout from the opposite end of the line signaled for the colonists to flee as the first group held off the attack. Within 15 minutes, the wagons had been mobilized and were on the move. In a final act of desperate faith, one man carved into a tree outside of the now abandoned colony the word Croatoan. It was his thought that by the grace of God, should a man on the line survive, they would need to know where the company was headed. The attacks on the line were sporadic after the first 3 men fell. A man would fall, a volley of musket fire would ensue, and then nothing. The men would go looking in the area of the fallen man. They would find pieces of clothing, torn appendages with some removed entirely, a torso crudely vivisected and bereft of flesh. Organs and intestines spilled across the rough, cold ground, and pools of crimson. The men trembled at these horrific scenes, but their nerve held strong and they still kept their faithful watch. The attacks would come like lightning, and always in the same manner. First, a breeze would come. Cold, a bone-chilling cold. And on the breeze would be that foul stench which made their eyes water and their stomachs churn. Then one of the men would scream and fall from view. If the eyes were quick enough, they would catch a glimpse of a fleeting shadow which would disappear with the body of the fallen man. No musket ball could touch it, it seemed, and no man of the line was fast enough to score upon it with their sword. and it always happened in threes, with an elongated break in between. 20 men soon became 14, and then 14 became 5. The last 5 stood, now with their backs facing one another, swords drawn, and watching all sides at once. They shared a common terror and a sense of dread for the next coming breeze, though, should something come from one of them now, the others would have a better chance of attacking the evil that hunted them. They waited patiently, breathing heavily, listening intently for any movement and watching. A cold breeze came, and with it, the smell. One man screamed and fell, and the men turned to see a tall, gaunt, skeletal figure bent over the fallen man and sliced the man's chest open with its elongated, talon-like forefinger. The sight caused the men to freeze momentarily, and in that time a second gaunt figure rose quietly behind the rearmost man. It placed its hand upon the man's head, and the man's expression turned to rage. He lifted his sword high and struck down 2 of his compatriots before the stunned fighting men could regain their composure. The creature released his grasp of the man, and the man dropped to his knees. He used his knife to open the doublet and the shirt of the fallen friend and protector, slice off a piece of flesh from his arm, and devour it in front of the others. Of the 2 sane men left, one raised his sword against the corrupted man, and then fell himself as a third creature showed itself and took him down. Of the last sane man, the second creature made short work. The 3 Ouijigo stood at the end of the slaughter, watching the last man devour what was left of his prey. Then, all 3 in unison turned to look down the road which the rest of the colony had fled by. A cold breeze blew, and they were gone, leaving the corrupted one to finish his feast. The slaughter of the fleeing colonists was just as methodical. As night fell, the attacks began, starting with the rear. The colonists were eaten. The pack animals were left dead, but not desecrated. Wagons were overturned. Farm animals fled into the woods, but no colonists survived. The Mantatu stood alone in the abandoned village, a small fire lit to keep him warm. He waited calmly for their return. As he sat near the fire, a cold breeze blew through the center of the village. The stench of death which accompanied it was unbearable to him. A raspy voice whispered behind him, "Qui kabi de te buk." The holy man stood and turned to face the Ouijigo. He drew his knife and waved it broadly at them. "You have accomplished what you have been asked to do," he directed them. "Your time here has ended. Return back to the setting sun." The 3 did not move. No one was there to hear the holy man scream. In August of 1590, a landing party arrived on the shores of the Roanoke. They had come from a larger sailing vessel with supplies for the small colony. Several men exited the landing boat and walked upon the shore. It was a short walk from where they had made berth to the colony. Upon reaching the colony, the men found it abandoned and severely overgrown with various crops and vines. Upon a tree at the entrance of the colony was carved a single word, Croatoan. The leader of this group, a tall and stately man of high birth, rejoiced at what he had found. He believed the colony had relocated to the island of Croatoan, and therefore no further investigation into the empty settlement was necessary. They did not see the bleached bones of the colonists on the opposite end, nor their shredded clothing, nor their rusted weapons, nor the 3 gaunt shadows which stalked them as they returned to the beach. Did that stately leader of the resupply party decide rightly to follow the signs to Croatoan? As it is told, the expedition had to be called off because one of the ships didn't make it. I wonder why. Thank you, my friends, for joining us this evening for this episode of Fireside Nightmares.
Tonight's episode of Fireside Nightmares was sponsored in part by Everbright Solutions. When you need your lighting display done by professionals and done right, Everbright Solutions is there for you. Find them on Instagram at everbright_solutions_LLC and also by Redicus. Redicus is a leading cross-border e-commerce enterprise with a diverse product lineup including service calling systems, guest pager systems, tour guide systems, window intercom systems, conference devices, FM transmitters, and radios. Find them online at www.retekess.com. Be sure and listen in next week for our installment of Fireside Nightmares. These original short stories, based on folklore, urban legends, and the odd, demented flight of fancy, are sure to entertain and terrify. Good night.